Let's get started. It's so great to have you all here today. I know we've got interest from all over the world on this topic. I know we have people registered from the UK and from other places in Europe and Australia and some other Asian countries. So it's wonderful to have you all with us today. Our topic is capitalize on India trade on the India trade growth story for market entry. And I'm Bill Kenny. I'm with Meet, and we help international companies soft land and scale in the US through trade shows and events. And today we are very fortunate to be joined by Nilesh Gopali, who is the founder and CEO of AAVOR, and he's joining us. It's 9:30 at night in Mumbai, India, and we're so pleased that you stayed up with us, Nilesh, and I know you're not feeling well. I'm actually not feeling that well. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Absolutely. And we have, Nilesh and I have both agreed that if we need to, we will put our mics on mute to sneeze. So hopefully we don't sneeze on the group today, but in any event, we're good to go, and it's great to be with you all. So for those that haven't been on our webinars before, in these type of webinars where it's more dialogue, we've got some pre-planned questions that we're going to go through with Nilesh to really kind of get through maybe some of the bigger issues around India market entry. Many of you have submitted questions as well, and we'll definitely endeavor to get to all those, and we'll also certainly be open for additional questions. So if you want to add questions to the chat, please feel free to do that. And just so you know, you uncover the chat by just moving your cursor over the main screen, and it should reveal a chat button that will create a chat box on your left-hand side, or on your right-hand side, and just enter questions there. Or feel free, once we're kind of through the main portion, I'll invite anyone to unmute and ask questions as well. So certainly very glad to have you all here. Just so you know, as a way of background, Nilesh and I met this past June at the Select USA Summit in Washington, D.C., and then actually had a couple of days together on a continuation event in New Jersey. So we've had some really good dialogue. We've talked, we talked probably every month or two since then, and are finding some neat ways to collaborate. But he's had experience at certainly helping companies enter India, mainly from Europe and the UK and the US to India, but he's also helped Indian companies enter other markets, European, UK, and US. So with that, Nilesh, maybe if you wouldn't mind taking maybe a minute and give us a bit of a background on yourself and kind of what got you into this space, what made you interested in market entry.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for that preamble, and thanks for giving both of us a chance that if we do sneeze, then we can go on mute. Thanks for that, Bill.
Sure.
So right, a bit about myself. I've spent about nearly 15 years in London, UK. Spent my time there doing my own consultancy for about 10 years. And then I came back to India 5 years ago as a head of a B2B e-commerce company. So my experience of working in UK and traveling in obviously Europe, US, Canada, and then coming back to India has something that actually others found out rather than me, where different departments started telling me that I have a very good way of thinking, both like a Westerner as well as an Indian, because I'm born and brought up here, and then worked for a long time in UK, and then came back 5 years ago, and then did a market entry of a British company. So that's where a lot of companies started connecting me, asking me to help them. And I started off more like a voluntary basis. About 3 years ago, I was appointed as a business mentor in London Mayor's program. And that's where it started. So officially, I started about 1.5 years ago on doing this international business advisories of helping European, couple of US companies for their market entry into India, and also vice versa. taking Indian companies to UK and Europe. So
And I'm
it's
sorry.
just that experience which helped me started thinking on both sides, which paved the way for me to start this consultancy.
Cool. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about AAVOR and what you do. What are the sort of core components of your service to the market entry companies?
Largely, I would say that I help international companies right from the initial market validation, market entry, strategically thinking, market product fit, and then getting them into India. So this is very high level I do, and more focused on the tech companies like fintech and health tech and any sort of technology companies. That's a very high level perspective. I also help companies raise funds, cross border funding, US companies, UK companies getting funding in India and vice versa. There is other thing that I also do is that some of these companies have got an expertise within their own organization, but they probably may or may not have either built products or services because they may not be in demand. But when you have a cross-border vision and cross-border market validation, so many times you unearth a product or a service where you have the skills and the expertise, but you have not developed it. And I work with the board of directors to develop that and then bring that either in India or Asia Pacific market.
Hmm.
So that's something which I have realized that is more of an additional thing, which other service providers like me don't get into. And of course, the proximity of me being able to travel to UK and Europe makes it easier for them to have a face-to-face dialogue about India and then get them into India.
Perfect. So now let's shift to actually talking about India market entry, and probably best to talk about India first. So, you're well traveled and you've spent a fair amount of time in the UK and the US and so on, and throughout Europe. And so when you're sort of looking kind of big picture, um, what do you find sort of the major differences are between sort of commercial services or entering these markets, particularly with a tech-based product? What's the difference between sort of entering the US or the UK with entering India? What are sort of the profound differences that you know?
Okay. So I think what we have to understand is the major difference between India and the Western world is based on the cultural issues and cultural opportunities.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is the Western world is more transactional and India is more uh, based on relationships. And within that, as a sort of a larger, I would say, picture, India is very price sensitive, which actually makes a lot of things deviate from the Western world. So in US, if you're entering US, Canada, or UK, you might go in with a similar model or probably similar sort of a product. I won't say similar price, but slight tweaking in the price. But when it comes to India, because of the geographical differences, each region is almost like a country, the languages, the cultural differences, and everything that forms and makes India such a huge population of close to 1.4 billion people. You're looking at distributors and you're looking at a model where you may have to go through a third party person to be able to capitalize on that market. What that means is, to cut the long story short, you have to think very differently in terms of culture, um, price sensitivity, and a model where you may not be interacting with the customer directly, especially if it is B2C. There is a possibility that you may be interacting with some of the customers directly if it is B2B2C, but definitely look at a distributor model. And that changes the paradigm if you compare with the Western world,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And so really getting your channel strategy well thought out and well planned out is a really important part of India market entry, it sounds like.
Yes, definitely.
Fantastic. So maybe let's back up just a little bit to sort of, as companies think about, if India market entry is correct for them, is there an assessment that you do? And if so, what are the sort of core components of that?
Yeah, that's very important. That's usually the first piece that we do.
Hmm.
I mean, if I take a step back, traditionally market entry involved setting up of the company, going into the market, probably doing some sort of a tour, and then it involved more of setup, getting your team in place, your insurance, the legal team, accountants, everything in place, and then start looking at selling your products and services. That usually is the norm. But the new India, and the faster way to get into India is slightly in a different way, where you focus on sales as an objective, probably in the 12 to 18 months. But the first thing that you need to do prior to that is two steps, very important, is to check if the market is really, what do you say, if there is a if there is an opportunity for you to sell your products and services,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you go about that? The first one is for you to just go and talk to people, do a research, which is still traditional market entry, I would say. The second, which is the most important, I think this is what you and me, Bill, we have discussed in the past as well, is that you need to look at proof of concept or a pilot customer. That is that makes or breaks your market entry into India.
Mm.
Even before you set up your company in India, even before you have a team in India, you could actually have a proof of concept, or you could have a pilot customer in India. And that actually gives you a complete vision of what is it that you want to do. And that opens up so many avenues or feedback that you probably previously had not even thought of. And
Mm.
I would say that makes a difference. The market validation with a proof of concept or a pilot customers, and if it's a B2C, then probably working with a distributor to engage with a finite number of customers is the key.
Mm. And I would imagine when you do that, because obviously from a sales standpoint, it makes sense. Can we acquire customers? What's the ideal or best process to do that? But I would imagine at the same time, you're also operationally learning how to serve the market as well by having those first few early customers in the process, and whether that's 3 months or 6 months or whatever, but you're at the same time getting your sort of operational capacity and competencies squared away, that so when you are ready to sort of light the fuse and scale more quickly, you have a lot more competence from an operational standpoint. Is that correct, or how would you adjust that?
I have got slightly different thoughts on that. And I have worked with some of the companies here in India, and as well as international players coming into India as well. When you have a pilot customer in India, the product and the service that they might ask you to implement might be a slight deviation, or sometimes, I won't say major, but still slightly more than a significant deviation. So you're looking at coming up with a product or a service which probably is meant for India, but your core skills and expertise and experience is still within your company, if you know what I mean. What I'm trying to say here is that your product and service might be different, but your team, your company, your core skills, experience would still be the same. And if you're trying to implement that, again, as a proof of concept, as a pilot, you probably don't think of operations right now, because at the end of the pilot project, even the Indian companies know that you may back off, deciding that you may come back, let's say 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, or you might want to do it later on. So at that stage, once you have known what will work here in India is when you start thinking in terms of operational sort of capability, implementing it, and all those kinds of things, forming a team. But
Mm,
yes, learning what is it that you need to do from an operations standpoint of view is important, but implementing the operations may or may not be right, given where you are and the company and how you are thinking strategically for India.
mm,
Because India, you need to be strategically aligned and consistently follow up. And that
mm.
second part will only come if you know that there is something that you have will work in India, and that will only happen after you've done the pilot or the proof of concept.
Makes sense. So, excuse me, thinking about the companies that you've both worked with and that you've observed who are entering India, what do you find some of the major mistakes are that they make? That whether uh, it causes them to pivot or sort of recalibrate and maybe try again at another time or whatever. But where are the big faults in the process from what you've seen?
Okay. Uh, so I'm actually facing this as an issue because of the way it is being handled. And this is a very good question that you're asking, Bill, is that what are the major issues being faced? And mostly everyone would say cultural issues, is the environment, how big is India, it's
Mm,
the huge, and the other things. But if you look at fundamentally, the companies that are coming into India have done exceptionally well in their back home country. And
mm,
probably they've gone very fast and grown very fast. And that is the reason they are looking at international expansion. And what they have done in their back home country is that they have taken a lot of decisions which are probably different from what the home market is. And they've gone very fast and probably taken decisions and then backpedaled it to make it work. So when the senior management team is thinking of India, they are also thinking along the lines that, right, I need to spend some time, probably whatever, couple of months knowing India, and then I will be able to go it in the same style or fashion as I have done it here in the home country, or for that matter, their international expansion. And the biggest mistake that they do is to underestimate the way things are going to pan out in India. Within the first 3 months, they come up with some sort of a conclusion. They either decide that this is the way it is or this is not the way it is. And then they start saying that from fourth month, especially to reduce the cost, let's start getting into India. And that is where I feel is the biggest mistake, where I believe that first 6 months or even up to 8 months, you might need to do a lot of learning and have a steep learning curve. And then probably after that, have a very fast implementation, which works very well, rather than the style of 3 months or 4 months, some sort of an understanding, doing the implementation. And that usually backfires because you might get the first 10 customers or 15 customers, or you might even get the tip of the iceberg, but you will never get the chunk of the Indian customers, which is what you want. And once you're typecast as a company or a product of something else, it becomes impossible to reposition yourself.
mm. That makes
And
sense.
that is the biggest mistake. And obviously, there are other ones of underestimating the culture, the language, the regional differences, where you want to go, how you want to go, the person on the ground's feedback. But I suppose that everyone is aware of,
Mm,
if I'm not wrong.
sure. Are there, when you think about the leader of a market entry company, are there some questions that you would suggest that they ask, whether it's of the economic development agencies in India that are potentially supporting their market entry, of partners? Are there some sort of key, whether it's relational or support or intelligence type questions that you think would be helpful?
India as a country is very open for international companies, unlike some of the other Asian countries. But the Indian government here is very keen, which is for obvious reasons, that there would be benefit of Indian community and Indian population. So when an international market leader or a fast growing company is trying to get into India, there are two aspects that they should definitely think. Is to one, how they position themselves
Mm.
to ensure that there is a benefit of Indians, which means that the Indian government and the Indian bodies and everybody that you think of will definitely open up their arms and help you out. And secondly, what is the best way to go about doing that in a fastest possible way? Because in India, if the way it is that because it's relationship based concept,
Mm.
some of the meetings are not as productive as the Western world would expect. For example, an hour long meeting might go on for 2 hours where you just speak about just the personalities for the first 1 hour. But that's something that you need to go through as a preamble, you need to go through that as a process.
Mm.
But from a economic bodies and institutions and everybody, there is more than enough that you can think of who will definitely help you in case you have something which is for the good of Indians. And obviously you have to think from your perspective, how is the best and fast way to get into India?
The comment you made about an hour meeting going on for 2 hours or longer makes me think of an Indian wedding. They can tend to
Yeah,
be very long, right? Multiple days is very normal.
yeah.
Um,
I'll
so
give you an example, Bill.
sure.
When I came to India 5 years ago, I met somebody who actually taught me more than others in India. And he said that he only goes to Indian weddings and gets customers there. And, and he doesn't, and he said that if he knows that there is an Indian wedding happening, he will somehow get himself invited, and that's all he does. And he says if there are like 12 weddings he attends, which is
Mhm.
like one every month, which doesn't happen, it's like law of averages.
Right.
He says he would probably get 12 customers and then at least convert 3 or 4 of them. And he's a very small niche consultant, and he said he doesn't spend anything anywhere else. Anyway, jokes apart, what I'm trying to say is that in weddings and other places, it's the relationship. Once
Mm.
you build it up, um, Indians would prefer, I won't say substandard product. They would prefer a product which meets the needs rather than a premium or a best product in that category.
Sure.
And they would prefer it from a person with whom they gel well rather than taking it a best or a premium or a superlative product with somebody with whom they are not able to connect well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely does. Um,
Yeah.
so a minute ago, you were talking about the idea of customizing or sort of optimizing your value proposition and other marketing messages for the Indian market. Are there some sort of rules, or is it just good testing? But are there some sort of key things that are important to consider when developing your marketing message in India in terms of what you might say or how you might say it?
Yes. Again, another good question. This actually is sometimes you have to think completely different way when you are marketing in India or the messaging, and in fact the products and services as well. So taking in case where, let's say in some of the developed nations, you're using a channel of doing a direct marketing to the customers. So you're trying to reach out to the customers and you want them to buy the product and services. So you will do a marketing reach, your message would be centered around them as to how it is beneficial for them to take your product and services.
Hmm.
In India, your end customer might be a distributor. Never in your life you would even interact or meet or do anything with the complete end user.
Hmm.
So your entire marketing, your product, everything is geared through towards a distributor or a dealer or some sort of a channel partner who is your end customer, and your entire messaging would be how good is this product for their customers, and how good it is for you to work with us, and how financially it will be beneficial, and everything that comes along with that. So your entire product messaging is different because your end client is the same, but this time, rather than selling to an end customer, you're selling to an intermediary. And there could be a number of intermediary, just one. It could be a multiple layers, and you are just selling it to the first one to ensure that they will subsequently sell it to the next one, to the next one, and then it reaches to the end user.
That's fantastic.
So those are, again, very, very different, mind-boggling. And I have seen companies where they have come into India and said, oh, they will do an online marketing, and with 1.4 billion population, people will pick up. And to their surprise, which I already knew, there was not a single sale, even though the price was in line with the Indian products and services, because nobody wanted to buy that kind of a product online. And that kind of a product is to be bought in a shop where there is always go-to person. And that's a very big difference as compared to the Western world. I won't go into the reasons and other ones, but there is a huge difference there.
Yeah, no, that's great. So in a minute or two, we'll switch over to addressing some of the audience questions, and certainly invite our audience to add additional questions, whether via chat or unmute and just interrupt us and ask your question. But one more question before we do that. So thinking, obviously, you're a wonderful resource to help with India market entry, strategically, and helping the company really get a good methodology and entry strategy together. But what other resources should our audience know about that are available, whether it's for research or for supporting companies coming in? Are there any sort of key resources that are out there that you'd recommend that somebody considering to enter India make sure they at least check out?
Sorry. There are a number of resources, and especially this current government that is in place for the last 6 years, they have come up with a lot of government websites and resources for you to get an understanding of India as a whole. I won't be able to name all of them, but there is one which I do use, I won't say many times, but regularly. It's called as an India Brand Equity. I'll tell you the actual name. Just give me a second.
At the IBEF, the India Brand Equity Foundation?
Yes, that's the one. That's the one.
Cool.
It's a very good site.
I'm going to put the link in our chat, so if anyone wants to go out there, you can check it out.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that gives you market-wise information, sector-wise information, age, demographics. Also, it gives you the new technology, where it is going. Some of the information where international researchers have done and it has come through, then they make a short summary of that and make it available. So it's more of a, how do you say, a resource for so many other resources. So it gives you good understanding, and then it links up to other resources where you obviously can go and find more information. I did remember that they've also had a reference to somewhere in McKinsey, again, because it was a part of the Indian report. They put in there, and then they referenced it saying, this is what McKinsey is saying, and we believe this is what others are saying. So it's a good resource to start off with.
That's awesome.
And of course, people like me.
Right, exactly. You're an advocate and a user, I'm sure. So good. Any other resources that would be good to highlight at all?
I think it depends on what is it that you want to do. So there is a Startup India. Then if you want to look into health tech, then there is a There's one called as a, what was it? Just hold on.
I'm just putting the Startup India link into the chat as well. I would also suggest
there is Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. Again, it's an Indian terminology, which is where 100 million families are given an insurance of just over $7,000
wow.
In the health insurance, and that is very good for the health tech industry. And obviously for these reasons, and also because there is an increased health awareness, access to insurance, increased lifestyle and stress related issues in India, just on just under 5,000 startups have started in India in the health sector, health tech sector, and over $500 million have been invested. So if you're in this space, then the Indian brand equity and this website and a couple of other ones would be a good start for you to understand India and understand what is it that you want to do in that space.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
If it's finance, then there are other ones.
Right.
There are banking, then it's other ones. Obviously, sector like energy, there are different sites. I mean, I can make a list, probably send it out later. But again, this is something that I said would need for you to have first an understanding of, is India a market for you? And if yes, then how do we go about researching it along with finding that first customer, especially for the pilot customer or proof of concept?
And actually, I just, sorry, I feel like Columbo. I'm going to ask one more question before hopping to the audience questions. And this is probably a big issue for a lot of companies, or I would say even more so an opportunity. So India clearly has not only some industries that are strengths, I think of healthcare, technology in general, but it also has some phenomenal resources. The number of engineering schools in India is massive. From an India market entry strategy, when you're working with companies and building their staffing plan, are there some specific things that you have them do in terms of looking for specific parts of their staff or recruiting in India specifically?
Yes. In fact, coming back to my earlier answer, where you look at your end customer to be more of a channel partner or a distributor. So these are usually not the traditional ones. So your channel partner could be a bank. Your channel partner could be an educational institute. And that's where the complete shift happens. So when you're looking at India and the STEM resources, the educational institutes, the engineering colleges, and anything that involves good, trained, talented resources, then yes, you can work with each of them. And these institutions, right, including banks and educational institutes, there are sector-specific institutions, not just for example, there are ones for agriculture, there are ones for engineering, for machinery, then for pharmacy, there is different. So all of that, there is many of them. And when you go out and reach out to them, they will collaborate with you, they will synergize with you, and they will explore how do you work together. Because ultimately they know that there are talented resources and vice versa, you would like to capitalize on them. There is places where you might even form a joint venture to come up with a research center, which either is funded on both sides or is more of a talent inclusion on both sides. Those are the kind of things which even Indian government is very openly promoting, and they are in fact giving grants. So I know that some of the companies which are into not the traditional technology, but they are into shipping and energy, renewable energy, and those ones.
Yeah.
where they are working with some of the very good engineering and institutions here in India to collaborate and form a very small research center and come up with innovation, which can be used not only in India, but globally as well.
Perfect.
I'll just add on to this. Lot of, uh, I won't use the word lot, but there are many international companies coming into India because they believe, and this is again promoted, that what works in India, the probability of that working in 40% of the global population is very high. So if you're looking at developing a product and services for India, the probability of it being used again in back home,
Mhm.
competing with the big leaders and also across Asia Pacific and Africa is very high. And what you rightly pointed out, and that's where the talent, the resources, everything comes into picture, because you're not just thinking India, you're thinking probably half the world's population.
That makes sense. So we did have an online question submitted by Kimberly. So this is kind of an interesting question. So she asks, does the Indian market have a preference to where products are manufactured? Do you see any sort of bias in the Indian market in terms of the origin of the manufacturing of products?
Um, by and large, most of the Indians do not are not even aware where the products are manufactured,
Mm.
and they go with the product value, how it is marketed, and what the message is to them.
Mm.
Only obviously if there is a controversial issue, and if in or product or a service has been used for political reasons, or again, as I said, for if there is a controversy, then it impacts the sales. But other than that, it just does not impact at all. I know that recently, in fact, within the last 6 months, MG Motors launched a car called as MD Hector here in India. And it is obviously, MG is a British brand, and it was obviously projected as a message to being a British product, where it gives a very value for money in terms of the internet car. But the company is actually a Chinese company, and almost, I would say, probably most of them do not know that it's a Chinese company.
Mm. Mm.
So it does not matter where the product is manufactured or who the owner is, as long as there is a benefit to them, as long as the message that it goes to the end user, is that something that you can rely on and something that you can use. Hope that answers the question.
That's perfect. Cool. So let
Hello, Bill?
there's a geographic separation, but um, are there other attributes from what you know of the Brazilian market that maybe make it in other ways far apart from the Indian market?
Okay, that's an interesting question. With the Brazilian market, I mean, honestly, I don't know much about the Brazilian market, but I could do some very high level research and understanding in terms of the differences and the similarity. Brazilian market is, I mean, the population is just 200 million as compared to India's 1.4 million, sorry, 1.4 billion.
Mhm.
But the Indian economy is larger than Brazilian economy, but the per capita income of Brazilian is 4 times that of Indian.
Mm.
So that would make a significant difference in terms of how you reach out your products and services. And the similarity, which I was very surprised to see, is that they both have got very young population.
Mm.
62% of Brazil is below the age of 30, whilst close to 75% of the Indian population is below the age of 25.
Wow.
Which means that in the next 10 years, I mean, technically, India would be managing the entire world. Again, as I say, technically, anybody between the age of 30 and 40 is usually who runs the country. Again, that's more of sorry, I'm repeating it, but technically. But that's where, if you are thinking of a product and services in either of these countries, then you'll have to think of something where probably you might start slow now, but if you can engage with an audience which is young enough for the next 10 years, 15 years, then you're sorted.
Right. So our next question is, and I'm going to frame this a little bit just so it's narrowed down, and I apologize for anyone that asked these questions, and my framing may not be totally accurate. So feel free to again chime in either in the audio or in the chat, or pose your question later via email, and Nilesh and I are happy to respond. So the question is how to get entry with an existing business. So I'm going to assume that this is somewhat of because we've talked about a lot of the, at least at a high level, a lot of the operational and sort of sales type things. So we haven't talked about regulatory, and is entering India from a regulatory standpoint, what are some of the issues we need to talk about in that regard?
I think the regulatory issue in India is same as any other country. Probably takes more time than others. But yes, if there is a license required or if there is a regulatory approval required, then it does. It's something that you will have to plan out initially and then start looking at it. But that's something that would again be involved once you start to implement the strategy rather than on day one. Even in fact, within the money world, there is a regulatory sandbox has come. There's a lot of banks who are open to having a sort of a discussion even before an approval is done, just to understand what the product and services is. I wouldn't say that in the pharmacy and the medical health sector, because obviously it takes a long time. But to cut the long story short, the regulatory requirement is probably the same as any other countries, but probably takes more time than other countries because of the population and because of the number of applications that come through for these kind of approvals.
Got it. And actually, Kimberly asked another question here. Is there a resource to locate Indian-based manufacturers? If the market is price sensitive, perhaps it's best to consider making where you sell. So are there any resources that you know of, Nilesh, that would be helpful in terms of exploring Indian-based manufacturing options?
I mean, depends on how you want to sort of get into India. If you're talking about if you're talking about manufacturing in India, because India is a price sensitive, then there's a government body called as Invest India. And they interact with the international companies in their home country, in the place where they are based. And then they give them a lot of hand-holding information about everything of how they should come into India, what are the options, right from giving them land space, discounted land space, the place to manufacture, and again, connections with the local manufacturers. If they don't want to start ground up, but they want to give that more as an outsourcing requirement with a local manufacturer to manufacture, again, they would help them out. So there are resources depending on how and what are the options of you want to get into India. Again, from a pharmaceutical perspective, if you want to do a research in India, then there is slightly different path. Invest India wouldn't come into picture. But what I'm trying to say is there are ways and means. But yeah, even at a government level, there are some government bodies where you can actually tap into it. Does that answer the question, Bill?
We've talked a little bit about the startup ecosystem in India, I think because of the resources that you pointed us to, but are there any additional resources that you would point to in the startup ecosystem?
Startup ecosystem is very buoyant here in India. I don't know if you know the stats, but in the last 2 years, the number of startups, especially in the fintech space, here in India is more than the UK and Europe put together,
Mm,
and is probably in the same lines as has been started in US.
mm.
Um, so from government perspective, there is a Startup India, but there are a lot of I would say government, no, sorry, not government bodies, but trade bodies who also have a lot of initiatives. So, for example, Confederation of Indian Industry, then there is a Federation of Indian Industry, then there is a NASSCOM, which is the technology industry. So these industry bodies have got their own startup support and initiatives. Then you have the venture capitalist and the private equity funds have got their own initiatives, and that is more at an industry level. And they have got initiatives and they help a lot. So there is a lot of support there. It depends on where and what you're trying to do. You may be able to get help and support from multiple of these resources, institutions, to help you do whatever you want to do. I
Mm.
know it's a very, very high level, slightly vague answer, not a specific one. But again, as I said, I think it depends on what the kind of startup is, where they want to do,
Right.
and there are a lot of resources which I can take offline if that's a
Sure.
need.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, and actually, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a gentleman who I think, and this is a couple of years ago, but I had a Skype meeting with somebody who I think he was running a university-based incubator in India, and it was an engineering school, but they had I think it was like a 3-year or 5-year objective to birth or launch 5,000 companies. I mean, which just seemed incredibly aggressive, but very impressive to sort of hear about that, and the fact that um, they were really putting the challenge out there to their whole system to drive, essentially drive valuable startups. And yeah, it was really, really interesting and great to get those kinds of insights to your market. It's really
Yeah.
fantastic.
So 30 seconds on that, Bill.
Mm,
NASSCOM, which is the technology body for, sorry, which is the body for tech companies here in India,
mm,
they have an initiative called as 10,000 startups for India. So they are supporting 10,000 startups in India. Reliance, which is one of the very big industry here in India, they've got a very good accelerator. There are so many other ones who have got their own accelerator, but they support the startups to come there and then do whatever is go through the accelerator and come up with the product and services, and then go out in the market. Reliance themselves may or may not invest in that, but they still come through that accelerator. So there is a huge support for the startup ecosystem, and depending on, as I said, what it is that you're trying to do, different regions, different bodies, different sector, there's a huge support.
mm.
There's a huge support.
Makes sense.
The tendency these days for the millennials is not to go for a job, but to go for a startup,
Mm,
which is a complete paradigm shift. Just 20 years ago, it was a complete different change. And I would say even 10 years ago, it was still employment as the first option, where now it's complete change, where entrepreneurship and startup is the first option. And if you fail, then they tend to go with some sort of an employment.
cool. So we've got about 10 minutes, maybe 9 minutes with a little bit of close. I have 3 questions, and certainly anyone else can feel free to chime in. So we want to kind of pace through these, but they're I think really good ones. So are there particular products or services that India um, imports in a, sort of, what are the, if you know, and obviously you've also given us some great resources to look this up, but are there some big categories that India that India imports?
Um, okay. I would say, from a US standpoint of view, India imports a lot of machinery, um, probably I would say fuels, minerals,
Mhm.
They still do import some of the agricultural products as well. There is architectural thing which India imports a lot. So there is a lot of companies where it says that designed in UK or Europe and then manufactured in India. So you're talking about a technology import, then again aviation industry, organic chemicals, all those things are still imported in India. Um, and that's something that which Indian government is trying to change,
Mm.
but I would still say that it will take a long time for that to change. This will still be imported a lot. I know that we Indians do import a lot of agricultural products from Canada as well,
Mm.
and that's something that Indian government is changing. But it will take some time to change.
Got it.
Yeah,
Cool.
recently, a lot of fintech and health tech companies have started coming into India to sell their products and services.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't call it as an import, but there is a very large number of these companies trying to get into India and trying to capture them as a consumers.
Mm.
And including medical tourism, that's actually growing very fast.
Mm. So actually, that point you just made is a great segue to our next question, which is specific to health tech startups. So, what are the benefits of entering the Indian market as a health tech startup? Obviously, we know the market size is massive, but are there other and the health industry is very large and very mature in India. But what do you see as sort of the other interesting advantages or benefits of health for a health tech startup?
I think recently in the last probably I would say 5 7 years, Indian have become very aware of their health issues. Obviously, exposure to the international market, and also because of being again exposed to the international market, the lifestyle and stress related diseases have increased. Indian government have acknowledged that and have started this concept of Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, which is again meant for the poor people, for their giving them about just over $7,000 as an insurance access. Sorry, access to the insurance, which means the market is set up for a huge opportunity and growth. And this is, I think I did mention this, that health tech and fintech are the two most very buoyant sector here in India. For health tech, just under 5,000 startups have been started in the last 4 5 years with over 500 million investments. I personally know a lot of health tech companies coming from US and UK and Europe and getting into India. They're getting support from the Indian government, and there are other industry bodies who are supporting them because that's the need of the hour. So definitely, if there is a startup in health tech sector, they should definitely look at India.
Hmm, super. Um, Again, I'd encourage if anyone has any last questions, please feel free to enter them or unmic or unmute. Um, the last question from me, and this is another audience submitted question, which is, with the precursor that this is a long-term expansion play, what ways would your recommendation um, to pre-test, how would you recommend pre-testing the market for localization and product fit? Are there some specific things that you would recommend? And I know we talked about this off the top, but are there any other details in terms of pre-testing the market before you come in?
I think this, Bill, you and me, we discussed this. There are a couple of points on this one. First is to actually attend a lot of trade events here. Because when you attend the trade events, they give you a flavor of what products and services are available here in India. Uh, the developed nations and Western world so many times thinks of service as an end-to-end. Whilst here in India, it's perfectly fine to have a a service which just meets a specific need or a step in the entire end-to-end process. And because there are many dealers and distributors and many persons and channel partners, it sometimes becomes very difficult to provide the end-to-end service. So just a step on its own can be a service. And when you go and talk to these companies, you will realize that your product, which is probably covering the end-to-end, is may not be viable in this market. So that's a first step, I would say, awareness. And again, if you do the second, which I have been saying and I've been repeating in this call, is that if you do a market if you do a pilot project or a proof of customer with either channel partners or with the customers, those are the pre-test, I would say, to understand that your product and services is definitely viable here in India.
Hmm.
At the end of it, you might break your product into modular fashion just to meet the needs of India. And that also makes it easier for you to price it lower. Or some of these companies, they face it as they find it difficult to price, because once they break the service, they're actually going away from the automation, which is what has been done in the home country.
Hmm.
So there is a bit of a change in the way they have to produce the product. And that can be good, and that may not be good depending on what the company and what the product is. It's a more of a conceptual talk that I did, just to be across the board. I hope that makes sense, Bill.
Yeah, no, very much so. So before we thank you and ask for any final comments, I'm going to share our webinar schedule looking ahead to December. So we have our next webinar is on Thursday, December 5th at 11 a.m. Eastern US time or New York time. And it's the 5 keys to measuring trade show and in-person event ROI. So this is a question we get a lot around sort of understanding what you're getting out of event participation. And Nilesh has sort of mentioned in India market entry, it's also important to attend and participate in events. And so we're going to spend some time on that, and really part of the idea is to close out the year with that as a topic as well, so that the 2020 planning is better optimized, because you know what things are working well for you. So Nilesh, I have to thank you so much for treating us with your both your wisdom and your presence today, and also staying up a little bit late when you're particularly not feeling well. So thank you. Are there any sort of additional comments that you'd like to make before we close up this webinar?
I would say thank you, Bill, for giving me this opportunity. India is a very fast-growing market as compared to the developing market. And I think if somebody's thinking of growth or cross-border, India should definitely not be ignored. I'm not saying that you should definitely come here, but you should not ignore it. You should probably do explore the market. And if your business call is to not to go ahead here, that is fine. But ignoring is probably not the right thing to do.
Got it. That certainly makes sense. And so just so everybody knows, we'll do a follow-up email in the next couple of days with this recording. And I'll also copy Nilesh in, so anyone that wants to touch base directly with him, you're more than welcome to do. Certainly touch base with us. We can help you make that connection as well. But again, thank you, Nilesh. And we really, really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all of your great experience with us. And certainly for everybody on, I hope this was helpful for you, and make sure you, connect offline with any additional questions or any way that either we or Nilesh can be of help to you. Thank you all. Thank you, Nilesh.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you.
Bye-bye.